The charity concert at Il Giardino had been designed as a celebration, a carefully orchestrated evening meant to honor legacy, generosity, and the enduring influence of Forrester creations on both fashion and community. Light spilled across marble floors in soft gold tones, catching the edges of crystal glasses and polished silverware, while a quiet orchestra filled the air with a melody that seemed almost too gentle for a room so full of ambition, history, and unspoken rivalries. Members of the Forrester and Logan families moved through the crowd with practiced elegance, their smiles composed, their gestures controlled, as though each of them understood that tonight was not merely about charity, but about image, about power, and about maintaining a narrative that had been carefully protected for decades. Beneath the surface of that refined atmosphere, however, tension lingered like a shadow that refused to disappear, subtle but undeniable, embedded in every glance that lasted a second too long and every silence that followed laughter just a fraction too late. Liam stood near the stage, his posture straight, yet his expression carrying a quiet weight that few noticed at first. He had volunteered to introduce the evening's central presentation, a retrospective video titled The Journey of Forrester Creations, and while the role appeared ceremonial, there was something deliberate in the way he held himself. As though he understood the gravity of what was about to unfold far more than anyone else in that room. When he finally stepped forward, the music softened, conversations faded, and a hush fell over the audience, not out of obligation but out of genuine anticipation. The Forresters and Logans had always known how to tell their story, how to transform decades of triumphs and scandals into something that resembled myth rather than reality, and tonight promised to be another carefully curated chapter in that ongoing narrative. The screen flickered to life behind him, and at first, everything unfolded exactly as expected. Images of iconic runway shows cascaded across the screen, capturing moments of innovation and bold creativity that had defined the company's identity. There were glimpses of early struggles, of designs sketched in cramped offices, of partnerships forged through both passion and necessity. The faces of Eric, Ridge, Brooke, and others appeared in a seamless progression, each frame reinforcing the idea that Forrester Creations was more than a business, that it was a family, a legacy, a symbol of resilience and reinvention. The audience responded warmly, some smiling with nostalgia, others nodding in appreciation of the story being told, a story they believed they already knew. But then something shifted. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a slight distortion in the sequence that caused a faint ripple of confusion among those paying close attention. The music, which had been steady and reassuring, seemed to hesitate, as though it too had been caught off guard. And then the screen changed, abruptly, jarringly, replacing the polished montage with something raw, unfiltered, and unmistakably real. The image that appeared was grainy, its colors muted, its angles imperfect, but its content was devastatingly clear. It was security footage, dated from years ago, showing the interior of the Forrester mansion, a place that had always been associated with both grandeur and secrecy. At the center of the frame stood Brooke and Ridge. The room seemed to inhale as one, a collective breath drawn in shock as the footage unfolded without warning, without explanation, without any attempt to soften what was about to be revealed. Brooke's posture in the video was rigid, her movement sharp and deliberate, her face marked not by confusion or fear but by a controlled, simmering anger that suggested something far deeper than a fleeting argument. Ridge, in contrast, appeared tense but reactive, his gestures defensive, as though he was trying to manage a situation that had already begun to spiral beyond his control. There was no sound, but the intensity of their confrontation transcended the silence, communicated through every movement, every expression, every inch of space between them. For those watching, it was not just a private moment made public. It was something far worse. It was the unraveling of a truth that had been buried so deeply that many had forgotten it could exist at all. The argument escalated in a series of rapid, almost chaotic movements, and then it happened. Brooke, fully aware, fully conscious, driven by a surge of emotion that could no longer be contained, pushed Ridge. The moment stretched in the minds of those watching, each second expanding into something unbearable as Ridge's body lost balance, his form tipping backward toward the staircase behind him. There was a brief, almost surreal pause, a fraction of time where it seemed as though the outcome could still be reversed, as though reality itself might intervene and rewrite what was about to occur. But it did not. Ridge fell, his body striking the steps in a sequence of impacts that felt both distant and immediate, echoing through the silent footage and into the stunned consciousness of everyone in the room. The screen froze. And Il Giardino, moments ago filled with warmth and celebration, collapsed into a silence so complete that it felt suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. The air itself seemed to thicken, as though it could no longer support the weight of what had just been revealed. Then, slowly, almost hesitantly, whispers began to form, spreading through the audience like a fracture line, each murmur carrying disbelief, confusion, and a growing sense of horror. The image on the screen remained unchanged, its stillness amplifying the chaos it had unleashed, forcing everyone present to confront a reality that could not be undone, could not be explained away, could not be softened by time or memory. Ridge stood among them, but he no longer seemed part of the room. His face had drained of color, his expression caught somewhere between recognition and denial, his eyes fixed on the image as though it held the key to a past he had never fully understood. Memories, fragmented and distorted by time, began to resurface, each one colliding with the undeniable clarity of what he was now seeing. For years, the accident had existed as a narrative shaped by uncertainty, by gaps in recollection, by explanations that had been accepted because they were easier than the truth. But now, there was no ambiguity. There was only the stark, unrelenting reality of what had happened. And it had not been an accident. His gaze shifted, slowly, almost unwillingly, toward Brooke. She looked as though the ground beneath her had given way, her composure shattered, her face pale with a terror that could not be concealed. Words seemed to form on her lips, fragile, desperate attempts to deny what was being shown, but they dissolved before they could take shape, rendered meaningless by the evidence that loomed above them. The woman who had spent years rebuilding her image, redefining her place within both family and society, now stood exposed in a way that stripped away every layer of protection she had ever constructed. Hope and Steffi stood nearby, their reactions mirroring the devastation that rippled through the room, yet uniquely their own. Hope's expression was one of profound disbelief, her understanding of her mother collapsing under the weight of what she had just witnessed. The foundation of trust, of love, of identity itself, seemed to crack in an instant, leaving her suspended in a reality she could neither accept nor escape. Steffi, on the other hand, carried a different kind of anguish, one rooted not only in shock, but in a painful confirmation of suspicions she may have buried long ago. For her, the footage was not just a revelation. It was a vindication that came at a cost too great to bear. Around them, the audience transformed from witnesses into judges. Voices rose, no longer restrained, calling for accountability, for justice, for consequences that matched the severity of what had been revealed. The image of Brooke, once synonymous with resilience and complexity, began to shift, reshaped in the eyes of those present into something far darker, far more unforgiving. In a matter of moments, perception had turned into condemnation, and the line between truth and judgment blurred into something dangerously absolute. Then came the sound that shattered whatever illusion of control remained. Sirens. They echoed from outside, growing louder, closer, cutting through the tension with a clarity that left no room for doubt about what was coming next. The arrival of the police was not a possibility. It was an inevitability, a direct consequence of a truth that had finally refused to stay hidden. Panic took hold of Brooke, sharp and immediate, overriding whatever fragile composure she had managed to maintain. Instinct drove her to move, to escape, to find some way out of a situation that had closed in on her from every direction. But the room had already shifted, the people within it no longer neutral, no longer passive. Space disappeared, Paths narrowed, and before she could reach the exit, she found herself surrounded, contained within a reality that offered no escape. And in that moment, as the doors opened and the weight of authority entered the room, the carefully constructed world of Il Giardino, of Forrester creations, of the families who had defined themselves through both love and rivalry, finally fractured beyond repair. Because some truths, once revealed, do not simply change the future, they rewrite the past. The first instinct in the room was not compassion but recoil. It happened almost invisibly, a collective physical response from people who moments earlier had been smiling at Brooke over champagne and soft music and now could not bear to stand too close to her, as though guilt itself had become contagious. The officers moved through the crowd with controlled urgency, their presence calm but absolute, and that calmness somehow made the scene even more brutal. There was no dramatic struggle, no wild outburst that could have turned the moment into spectacle. The horror came from the opposite. It came from the fact that Brooke, stripped of every defense, looked suddenly smaller than anyone in that room had seen her in years. The woman who had survived scandal, heartbreak, public humiliation, family wars, and the endless cycle of destruction and forgiveness that defined this family now stood in the center of the storm with nowhere left to run, her eyes darting not toward strangers, but toward the people she loved most. As if she still hoped one of them might step forward and tell her this nightmare could somehow be stopped. No one did. Ridge could not move. He remained frozen where he stood, his body rigid, his breathing shallow, his face carrying the sick, haunted stillness of a man whose past had just been returned to him in the cruelest possible form. For years, the fall had lived inside him as pain without shape, as a trauma he had learned to carry without ever fully understanding its origin. He had rebuilt around it. He had made peace with fragments. He had convinced himself that some questions were better left in the dark because reopening old wounds would only poison the life that remained. But the footage had annihilated that fragile peace in seconds. What hollowed him out was not only the violence of the act itself, but the unbearable clarity of Brooke's face in that recording. She had not stumbled. She had not reacted blindly in fear. She had not reached for him in some desperate accident that had gone wrong. She had made a choice in anger, and that choice had sent him crashing into a nightmare that had shaped years of his life. He looked at her as if he no longer knew what human language meant. His expression was not rage at first. Rage would have required certainty and energy, and he was still trapped in a deeper place than that, somewhere between grief and dislocation, like a man watching his own life from a distance and realizing that one of its central truths had been built on a lie. Every memory involving Brooke began to shift in his mind, not cleanly, not logically, but in jagged, vicious flashes. Arguments they had survived, reconciliations that now felt contaminated, tenderness that suddenly seemed suspicious. All the times he had defended her, loved her, returned to her, protected her from others and from herself. Each memory trembled under a new question he had never imagined he would have to ask. If she had been capable of that, then what else had he misunderstood? And worse, how many years had he spent giving his heart back to the person who had destroyed his trust in a single moment he had not even remembered correctly? Hope stepped toward Brooke on instinct, then stopped midway, the movement collapsing before it was complete. That hesitation cut deeper than any accusation could have. Until this second, she had always found a path back to her mother, even through disappointment, even through shame, even through the endless family wars that had forced daughters to inherit their mother's grief. But what she had just seen was not a rumor, not a manipulated story, not one more bitter retelling of old family history. It was evidence, cold, unblinking evidence. And Hope, who had spent so much of her life defending Brooke against judgments from the Forrestons, suddenly found herself face to face with the possibility that those judgments had not all been cruelty. Some of them may have been truth seen too early, truth she had refused to accept because love had made it unbearable. The betrayal was not only moral, it was intimate, it was existential. Brooke had always been, to Hope, a complicated woman but a real one, flawed yet fiercely loving, wounded yet determined, a mother whose mistakes came from pain, not from malice. That belief was part of Hope's emotional architecture. It shaped how she loved, how she forgave, how she justified the chaos around her. Now that architecture had split open, she stared at Brooke not like a daughter looking at a criminal, but like a child suddenly realizing that the face she trusted most had hidden something monstrous for years. And the terrible thing was that Brooke's panic did not help her. The weak denials, the shaking hands, the wild terror in her eyes only made her seem less innocent, not more, because innocence does not collapse under proof. Innocence stands. Brooke was crumbling because some part of her knew that there was no defense left to give. Steffi's pain took a harsher shape. While Hope stood suspended in heartbreak, Steffi seemed to ignite from within, not in triumph, because there was nothing triumphant in this, but in the old, scorched place where suspicion had lived for years. She had always believed Brooke's chaos came with consequences other people had to pay for. She had always seen Brooke as a storm the Logans called love, and the Forresters were expected to survive. Yet even she had not prepared herself for this. Seeing her father fall on that screen, seeing the deliberate force of Brooke's anger, turned years of resentment into something almost sacred in its fury. This was not family drama. This was not another chapter in an endless romantic war between Ridge and Brooke. This was violence. It redefined every defense Brooke had ever been given, and every excuse people had made for her volatility. Steffi felt not vindicated but sick, because vindication was too small a word for the destruction of illusion on this scale. Eric watched from a distance that felt both physical and emotional. Age had given him patience, and power had given him the habit of restraint, but neither could shield him from the devastation unfolding before him. The room, the families, the company, the carefully maintained public image of dignity and endurance, all of it had just been dragged into the ugliest kind of exposure. Forrester Creations had survived affairs, betrayals, paternity shocks, corporate battles, and personal disgrace, but this was different because it introduced something irreversible. Criminality. Hidden violence. A buried incident resurrected at the worst possible moment and in the most public possible way. Eric did not only see Brooke being cornered by police. He saw shareholders panicking, headlines multiplying, charity donors recoiling, the family name becoming synonymous with scandal once again. Yet beneath that patriarchal calculation was something sadder. He saw the collapse of a story he had once wanted to believe about redemption. Brooke had been woven into the fabric of his family so completely that her disgrace was no longer hers alone. It stained everyone. Outside, the siren stopped, but inside the sound kept ringing in people's nerves. The officers approached Brooke, and at last the paralysis in Ridge broke, though not in the way anyone expected. He took one step forward, then stopped again, as if some ancient reflex to protect her had collided with the horror of what she had done. That conflict gutted him. Love does not die instantly, not even under betrayal this severe. It recoils, it fractures, it becomes unrecognizable, but it does not vanish on command. That was Ridge's torment in real time. A part of him wanted to demand answers, to force her to explain what could never be explained. Another part wanted to turn away forever. And beneath both impulses lurked a darker, more humiliating truth. A piece of him still reacted to her suffering. Even now, even after everything. That was the cruelty of old love. It could make a victim feel weak for not becoming cold quickly enough. Brooke's eyes found his, and for one suspended second the noise of the room seemed to disappear. She was not asking for absolution anymore. She had moved past that. What flickered across her face was more primitive and more broken. It was terror at being seen completely. Not as a romantic heroine, not as a survivor, not as a woman misunderstood by history, but as the author of irreversible harm. The exposure stripped away not only her social standing but her internal mythology. Brooke had spent years telling herself versions of the past that made survival possible. Maybe she had minimized that night. Maybe she had buried its intention beneath layers of guilt and rationalization until she no longer faced it directly. but the footage had dragged intention back into the light. She could no longer hide from the fact that in one moment of rage, she had crossed a line that separated cruelty from catastrophe. When the officers took hold of her arms, the room reacted in waves. Some guests pulled out phones. Others turned away in disgust. A few spoke in harsh whispers about justice delayed too long. The spectacle was merciless because society loves scandal most when it wears the face of someone once admired. Brooke's public humiliation became instant communal theater, and that degradation deepened the tragedy because it meant the truth would not be processed privately, with dignity or complexity. It would be consumed, repeated, weaponized. By morning, every outlet in Los Angeles would have her image frozen at the moment of collapse, the fallen icon of a charity gala transformed into a symbol of hidden violence among the elite. Hope finally moved, not toward the police, not toward the crowd, but toward the edge of herself. She could not stop what was happening, could not defend it, could not repair it, and that helplessness tore through her with almost physical force. Her mother's arrest was not simply a legal event. It was the destruction of emotional inheritance. It meant every future conversation would now happen under the shadow of that image on the screen. Every memory would be contaminated. Every defense she had ever made for Brooke would feel naive. She wanted to cry, but even grief felt too simple. What she felt was something more disorienting, the collapse of moral coordinates. The person who had taught her resilience had also carried a buried act of violence. The person she loved most had made herself impossible to recognize. Steffi, by contrast, stepped toward Ridge with a ferocious protectiveness that came from old wounds being reopened all at once. She saw the shock in him, but also the dangerous emptiness that often follows it, that numbness in which people are most vulnerable to rewriting their own pain to survive it. She would not allow that this time, not with evidence this clear, not with years of damage already behind them. Her loyalty to Ridge sharpened into something almost militant. She did not want him near Brooke, did not want him pulled again into guilt, pity, nostalgia, or the old gravitational field Brooke always seemed to generate around him. Steffi understood that this revelation could break him in more ways than one. Not only by confirming what Brooke had done, but by forcing him to admit how long he had kept returning to someone capable of it. That realization could breed shame, and shame could make even strong people vulnerable to emotional self-destruction. As Brooke was led away, her heel caught slightly against the floor, and the stumble, small as it was, carried an almost unbearable symbolism. For so many years, she had been the woman who recovered, who returned, who somehow found a way to stand again even when the world judged her. But this stumble felt different. It felt final. Not because a prison cell awaited, though that possibility was now real, but because her identity had lost the story that sustained it. She was no longer the woman accused unfairly, misunderstood by rivals, scapegoated by a judgmental family. She was now the woman seen on screen pushing Ridge in cold clarity. And no amount of charisma, tears, history